Marvel's adjacent universes.
Thank you. At the end of 2008's Iron Man, we saw a surprise post-credit scene following the film's conclusion, where Tony Stark, the movie's protagonist, is confronted by S.H.I.E.L.D. director Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson. Now, in this short exchange, Fury explains to Stark that he has become part of a bigger universe, signaling not only what this would mean for the future Iron Man film series, but for Marvel Entertainment and the world of superheroes as a whole. Essentially, Fury's exchange to Stark isn't just an explanation to the character in the film that things are going to go up a notch, but it's a declaration to the audience that we are going to explore the Marvel Universe on a scale never seen before. It's essentially signaling to the viewers that this isn't just going to be a series of Iron Man films, it's going to be fully fleshed out, interconnected, shared universe. Now, this isn't a novel concept in and of itself. The Marvel Universe, as it exists in comic book form, has been a sprawling, interconnected world since the early 1960s, beginning with the creation of the Fantastic Four in 1961. The success of that series launched a plethora of other books, from the X-Men, Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, Spider-Man, and so on. So much so that by the middle of the 1960s, and certainly by the end of the decade, the Marvel Universe, as it remains today, was fully breathed into life. This expansive, interconnected world where in one comic, Spider-Man is fighting bad guys on the Brooklyn Bridge, and just over the road, the Avengers are saving the day from an alien invasion. Now, with this, it is interesting to consider how the Marvel Cinematic Universe adapts this notion of an interconnected world. Since its debut in 2008, the MCU has become perhaps the most successful version of Marvel's universe to ever exist, grossing a total of nearly $30 billion since its beginning in 2008. Now, what I find interesting is this notion of the MCU as an adjacent universe. It was created to be a parallel world alongside the Marvel Comics universe that would adapt the interconnected nature of its storytelling, but on a grander transmedia scale. And while I think it's certainly the most successful, its historical precedent is interesting how it fits into a larger narrative and a larger history of attempts to create an adjacent universe. So Chambliss, Savatsky, and Fandino talk about how the Marvel Cinematic Universe's success comes from the fact that it's a series of interlinked films that mirror the deeply interconnected nature of their comic book media and essentially push the boundary of transmedia forward. So why it's so successful in a world where even by 2008, superhero movies were becoming commonplace, is it attempts to create this sprawling, lived-in world that hadn't existed previously. Kevin Feige notes similar, talking about how the success of the MCU and the success of the Avengers films comes from replicating the formula and the world that Marvel Comics has been successful in the last 60 years. So as I noted, while the MCU is certainly successful and noteworthy on its own, I think it's really interesting to consider it through the prism of this history of attempting to create adjacent universes. And in a way, I think it can and should be interpreted as the culmination of 30 to 40 years of efforts to create a secondary parallel Marvel universe that runs adjacent to the company's long-running comic books. As Liam Burke describes, that superheroes didn't make the leap from comics to screen in a single bound. Rather, it was a series of incremental steps. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe represents the final step in this process. But I think it's interesting to consider how we got here and the failed and somewhat successful attempts that Marvel made previously that paved the way for the MCU. So the question I want to look at today is how this comes into existence through three other adjacent universes, each published throughout a different decade, and have in some ways made a significant influence on the MCU. The first of these is the New Universe, a Marvel Comics line that existed from 1986 to 1989. The second is the Marvel Animated Universe, which existed from 1992 to 1999. And the third is the Ultimate Comics Universe, which ran from 2000 to 2015. So we'll briefly look at each of these three universes individually, and then consider their relationship and how they've influenced the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So let's start with perhaps the most obscure of these, the New Universe. The New Universe was the brainchild of noted supervillain Jim Shooter, who was editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. Honestly, you would think that I found the worst possible picture. He just looks like that in every picture. He looks like he's about to announce the Mutant Registration Act in every photo. So in 1986, this was kind of the height of Shooter's tenure as Marvel's editor-in-chief, and 1986 was celebrating 25 years of this lived-in Marvel universe, 25 years of the release of the first Fantastic Four comic. And to celebrate this, Shooter, as editor, and the writers that he worked with, proposed doing something drastic. Shooter proposed an initiative known as the Big Bang, where essentially they would restart the Marvel Universe from the beginning and usher in a kind of new, modernized version of the company's status quo. Now, the writers and artists and the creators at Marvel kind of pushed back on this. They didn't want to wash away, 25 years of storytelling. So what this eventually evolved into was a separate publishing imprint where they could tell more grounded, realistic, more modern stories and create a new roster of characters. Tom DeFalco, one of the lead writers in the new universe and eventually Shooter's successor, talked about how in the 25th anniversary of the Marvel Universe, Shooter embarked on his most ambitious project, celebrating the birth of the world built by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and many others by creating a brand new one that could rival it. So the new universe is interesting in a couple of ways. When it was first devised, there was a document sent round to the Marvel Comics offices where Shooter basically set a list of things that writers and artists can and couldn't do. Now, the big selling point behind it, both in how it was pitched internally and how it was marketed to readers, was this idea of it being the world outside your window, that it would be more realistic than main Marvel comics. You wouldn't have gods hailing down from the sky. You wouldn't have stretchy superheroes hit by cosmic rays. You wouldn't have teenagers bit by radioactive spiders. It would be a more realistic, modern world. There would also be no references or crossovers to the main Marvel comics. And the interesting fact here and how it relates to the MCU is the idea was that it would take place in real time. So between one issue to the next issue of a series, if a month passed in between when those comics came out, a month would pass within the stories themselves. Whereas obviously in traditional Marvel comics, Spider-Man has been in his early 20s for about 30 years. Sean Howe, in his book, Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, talks about how the idea was for these stories would be in a world just like ours, where the sudden ability to fly, where the notion of anyone developing extraordinary abilities would be truly awe-inspiring and wondersome. So in July of 1986, the new universe was formally ushered in with the lead series Starbrand, written by Jim Shooter himself. Starbrand, to kind of give you a brief overview of what it is, it details an ordinary guy called Ken Connell who gained superhuman abilities during what was known as the White Event, where essentially there is this blaring blast of white light and 0.01% of the population receive extraordinary abilities. And he's kind of our POV character into this world where metahumans exist. I promise you, it's not actually that interesting. But this book was followed by a slew of other titles that came out throughout the remainder of 1986, Spitfire and the Troubleshooters, DP7, Cyforce, Justice. These all sound like the Poundland version of Marvel Comics. And you'd be right in thinking so. And so what's interesting is how, well, I think there was certainly an interesting idea behind this series. It didn't quite work out as Shooter intended, partly due to things within the Marvel's control and partly due to things without Marvel's control. Most notably, right before the series was set to launch, Shooter and the team that was working on the new universe had their budget drastically cut, down from $120,000 to $40,000. Now, this massively affected not only the amount of books they could put out, but also the writers and artists that they could get to work on it. So a lot of the kind of top names in the industry at this point were either out of budget or didn't want to work on the title due to the fact that Jim Shooter has quite a polarizing legacy within the industry at this time. He was quite a prickly character and was quite apropos of burning bridges. And so with this, the New Universe titles come out in July of 1986 and kind of underwhelm, both in terms of the quality of the books themselves, because the writers that do work on it are people that are doing lots of work at Marvel already. So they're very much overstretched, very much overworked. And then on top of everything they're doing, be asked to come up with all of these new original ideas. And sales disappoint as well. In the Marvel Age magazine, which is probably the best way to find sales statistics from this period, they have the top 10 best-selling comics of 1986. Now, Starbrand issue 1, the kind of flagship New Universe book, is number 7 in the top 10 charts, and Spitfire, the other book launched in this period, is number 8. Now, between this and when the universe folded in 1989, these are the only time any New Universe books would crack the top 10 sales of any Marvel comic. So essentially, this kind of universe petered out almost as quickly as it began. Within less than a year of it being conceived, due to declining sales and the fact that it was losing so much money, the universe was cut in half. Half of its titles were just completely scrapped outright. And not long after, Jim Shooter was fired by Marvel and no longer worked on the new universe. Other writers, such as Tom DeFalco, attempted to salvage it and try and make something of it. But by 1989, the writing was on the wall, and they eventually killed the entire universe off in a short mini-series called The War. But I still think it's quite interesting, and it has a notable relationship with the MCU for several reasons. Firstly, it's Marvel's first ever attempt at building a purposeful, interconnected universe, whereas kind of the traditional Lee and Kirby Marvel Comics universe developed naturally. This was a clear attempt from day one of creating a lived-in, adjacent, interconnected world. It also incorporated the passage of real time and kind of stayed true to that mantra of the world outside your window. And as Timothy Donahue notes, the new universe's legacy ultimately paved the way for the future of comic book storytelling, both within the printed page and how the characters would evolve in transmedia representation. Now, switching gears a few years later, in the early 1990s, Marvel began to consider other ways in which they could have an adjacent universe. And perhaps one of the most successful renditions of this is the Marvel animated universe. Now, Marvel had had a strong presence in animation since the early 1960s. And while they had a steady slew of shows throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were all very self-contained. You had Fantastic Four shows, you had Spider-Man shows, you had the Marvel Superhero show, which had kind of little segments with a couple of different Marvel characters. And while they occasionally did cross over, there was no real notion that this was a fully lived-in world. Now, this changes in the early 1990s with the creation of X-Men, the animated series. Now, X-Men's quite historically significant for a number of reasons. It's kind of the birth of modern superhero animation. And the success of the show and the popularity led to Saban Entertainment, Fox Kids, and Marvel Entertainment producing a whole host of other shows in the following years. As you can see on screen, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, and Spider-Man all premiered 2 years later in 1994, and 2 years after that, we also got an Incredible Hulk series. Now, what is notable is that while some of these shows were produced by different companies and aired on different networks, they all existed within the same universe and very clearly defined so. And there were regular crossovers with characters, with recurring voice actors, character designs, and even the same writers working on multiple shows to make this feel as much of a lived-in world as possible. So the first example of one of these crossovers is in the second season of Spider-Man in an episode titled The Mutant Agenda. Spider-Man is growing extra arms and attempting to kind of cure what's going on. He pays a visit to Professor Charles Xavier and the X-Men and seeking to understand his secondary mutation. Subsequently, soon after, we would see the Hulk meet the Thing and the Fantastic Four in the episode Fantastic Fortitude. Iron Man and War Machine, two of the main characters of the Iron Man show, would also pop up in the Hulk. And then eventually these crossovers would culminate in the final season of Spider-Man in a 3-part adaptation of the 1984 comic Secret Wars, where Peter is transported to an alien planet and he has to essentially assemble a team of superheroes to battle an equally deadly team of villains. And it's made up of characters seen in all of the other Marvel animated shows. Here are just some examples of what I've been talking about on the screen. Now, this universe started to kind of fade away at the end of the decade with the cancellation of Spider-Man in 1987 and X-Men in 1998. Now, while they did try and keep this going on with replacement shows focusing on another Spider-Man show and also an Avengers series, they were nowhere near as popular, and because of Marvel's ongoing financial issues at this time, and with the company still kind of in the bankruptcy scare, the budget wasn't there for these new series. However, despite this, they still maintain this kind of shared cinematic universe approach. In the Avengers show, Hawkeye is perhaps the leading character, and he was a main supporting character in Iron Man, and both Tony Stark and Captain America make regular cameos throughout the season. And so overall, I think this has an interesting relationship with the MCU, not only as the kind of first transmedia adaptation of the Marvel Universe, but in its attempt to be a running for almost a decade series of interconnected shows that all cross over and self-reference each other with similar actors and writers and producers all working on them, climaxing with an adaptation of Secret Wars. It was so influential, in fact, that Avi Arad, one of the lead producers on the X-Men animated series, was so in love with the show that he vowed to make it his life's work to bring Marvel superheroes onto the big screen. He would not only work as a producer on films like X-Men and Spider-Man, but he would also go on to found Marvel Studios and hire Kevin Feige. As Robert Harvey writes, animated cartoons are interesting because they have a foot in two mediums. They're essentially a bridge between the printed page and the kind of big screen of cinema. And as Liam Burke notes, that this Marvel animated universe essentially became a proving ground and a testing place to see if we could take the lived-in world of Marvel Comics and apply it to a more serialized cinematic approach. And the show's success and longevity and the legacy of these shows that are still fondly remembered today, and the similarities between this series and the MCU suggest that to some extent, they were right. Now, the final universe I want to touch on today is another comic book universe, this being the Ultimate Universe. So for a little bit of context, Marvel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December 1996. This went on for the next 2 or so years, where eventually they came out of bankruptcy after merging with Toy Biz. Now, the fallout of this merger saw Bill Jemas, who was the president of a trading card company, Fleer, take over as the vice president of Marvel Comics. So he was kind of the guy running the show into the new millennium. Now, in an attempt to revitalize Marvel's popularity and rebrand for the new millennium, Jemas came up with this concept of ground zero, not unlike what Shooter proposed in the 80s of restarting the Marvel Universe. Now, he worked alongside Joe Quesada, who was the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, kind of the main creative voice within the company itself. And this concept evolved into a separate comic book line that would take all of Marvel's most successful characters and reimagine them for the 21st century. So essentially, what if instead of Spider-Man being a 15-year-old kid bit in 1962, what if he was a 15-year-old kid in 2000 being bit, and how would that change the world of Spider-Man? The Ultimate Universe was designed to kind of capitalize on this first wave of Marvel adaptations on screen, with the release of X-Men in 2000 and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man in 2002. They wanted to position themselves to be the first comic that people who watched those movies could dive into. Bill Jemas talks about this in the foreword that he wrote to the collected edition of the first volume of Ultimate Spider-Man, talking about how the idea was to capitalize on the success of these live-action movies and essentially present a comic book world that not only closely resembled the film, but act as a bridge between the traditional comics and the adaptations. He talks about how the idea is that any new reader can pick up an Ultimate comic and immediately be familiar. So in September of 2001, the first comic in this series, Ultimate Spider-Man issue 1, is released. And then in December, Ultimate X-Men follows suit. Now, both these books were immensely successful. X-Men in particular was one of the best-selling comics of 2000. And this led to the creation of a new series in 2002 called The Ultimates. So just to kind of show you visually the difference in this adaptation, this is Peter Parker from the Marvel 616 universe when he first develops his powers back in 1962. And this is Ultimate Peter Parker gaining his powers in 2002. I have not cosplayed as Ultimate Peter Parker. I just want to clarify that. Similarly, you can see the difference in how these adaptations work. The original X-Men, designed by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, are transformed into a version much more akin to the cinematic renditions than any comic book run previously. And the same is true for the Avengers, who went from looking like this to a sight that's probably more familiar to moviegoers, which is this. So the Ultimates is interesting because, according to artist Brian Hitch, who drew the series, the intent from the very beginning was to essentially draw an Avengers movie. The belief was, well, they're never going to actually let us make an Avengers film, so let's kind of give readers a taste of what it would look like if we did. So it's essentially, the Ultimates comic is a blueprint for what an Avengers movie would be like made in the mid-2000s. Hitch describes it as a widescreen cinematic comic. It was the best-selling comic book of 2002, and Avengers director Joss Whedon noted how it brought the Marvel Universe into a modern age in the way no other book did. So just to show you some of the things that are identifiable in the Ultimate comic that were later brought over into the first Avengers movie. On the top left, you can see the team's roster and the kind of character designs, which, comparing to the previous image I showed you, is a lot more like the kind of MCU depictions. On the top right is S.H.I.E.L.D. director Nick Fury, traditionally depicted in Marvel Comics as Caucasian. In this book, very clearly designed after actor Samuel L. Jackson. In fact, there's even a moment in the book where the Avengers are talking about who would play them in a movie. And Nick Fury says, I think Samuel L. Jackson would play me. The bottom left, the first kind of conflict they fight is against the Hulk. So it's this case of the Avengers fighting each other before they become a well-oiled team. And then the second half of the Ultimate story involves them all uniting to fight a new alien threat, a race that had never been seen in Marvel Comics before, the Chitauri. So Abraham Reisman, in his article, The Secret History of the Ultimate Universe, talks about how the Avengers that millions of people have seen on screen more closely resemble the Ultimates than they do any previous main comic version of the Avengers. The classic Avengers were a private club that lived in a mansion and had a butler and had weird members on the team like Jack of Hearts, whereas the Ultimates were this kind of paramilitary task force created by a government organization to solve and fight the battles that the rest of the world never could. Sean Howe, in his book Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, notes similar, saying that it's no accident that the Ultimates essentially became the blueprint for phase 1 of the MCU, and that it was intentionally designed to be a kind of test run and show how you could translate these characters into the big screen. Now, I've noted some of the main examples of similarities between the first Avengers movie and the Ultimates comic, but there's a slew of other ways in which these comics have influenced not only the Avengers movie itself, but also the first kind of 3 phases of the MCU. So a couple of examples listed on screen: the Hulk's origin in The Incredible Hulk, even down to Bruce Banner experimenting on himself, trying to recreate the super soldier serum, draws heavily from how he first appears in the Ultimates. Captain America's, the ending of the first Avenger, where he wakes up in the present day and he's kind of confronted by S.H.I.E.L.D., is taken almost directly from the opening of issue 2 of the Ultimates. Likewise, Captain America jumping out of a plane without a parachute in The Winter Soldier is taken from the very first page of the Ultimates, where Cap in World War II does the exact same thing. Likewise, the addition of Hawkeye's family, a thing not really seen in main Marvel Comics universe, as well as the addition of Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch in Age of Ultron, were taken from the second Ultimates book, Ultimates 2. And even it's worth noting that the Nick Fury post-credit scene in the original Iron Man movie was actually written by Brian Michael Bendis, the writer of the very first Ultimate comic, Ultimate Spider-Man. So here are some examples on screen of what I'm talking about. On the left, you have the Ultimate version of Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch. In the middle, you have Hawkeye and his family. And then on the right, you have the scene where Captain America jumps out of his helicopter without a parachute. And now with that, these influences continue even into more recent Marvel films as well. Hulk's rampage in Johannesburg in Age of Ultron resembles the first arc of the Ultimates, where the Hulk goes out of control and rampages throughout New York, and Iron Man and the Avengers have to stop him. Likewise, the death of Hawkeye's family in Age of Ultron and his arc where he kind of becomes this violent mercenary Ronin is taken from his arc in Ultimates 2, where his family is killed by Black Widow and Hawkeye goes on a quest for vengeance. Likewise, Thor's hammer Stormbreaker that appears in Infinity War is based on the Ultimate version of Mjolnir, and the focus of Spider-Man as a teenager growing up in this world of lived-in superheroes more closely resembles his depiction in the Ultimate Universe than it does in classic Marvel Comics, where he's normally depicted as being around of a similar age to a lot of the Avengers. It's also worth noting that Spider-Man No Way Home, a story that brings together Spider-Man from different universes, bears a lot of similarities to the 2012 series Spider-Man, which was the first meeting of the classic 616 Spider-Man and the Ultimate Spider-Man, Miles Morales. Again, here are some visual clues of what I'm talking about. On the left, you can see Thor, Ultimate Thor with Stormbreaker. In the middle, you can see Spider-Man and Nick Fury, a relationship that's built a lot on in Spider-Man Far From Home. And on the right, you can see Hawkeye going on his quest for vengeance after the death of his family. So overall, I think Ultimate Marvel is a quite clear inspiration on the MCU, especially in its early days, and the way that these kind of cinematic comics prove as a testing ground for how you can modernize the kind of classic Marvel universe and bring it into the 21st century. As Reisman notes, the Ultimate Universe is a compendium of stories that saved the company that launched it, revolutionized the comic medium, and became the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar Marvel cinematic empire. Similarly, Lapin Benoit notes that the Ultimate Comics heavily influenced the movies of Phase 1, that both series were trying to modernize the classic Marvel characters and tell more accessible stories to a mainstream audiences. And with that in mind, it's no coincidence that Joss Whedon, Jon Favreau, Kevin Feige, and the architects of the early MCU were drawing so heavily from these comics. So just to kind of go over how I think each of these universes are represented in the MCU and how the legacy of each one is still seen in them today. The new universe is perhaps the most obscure and the least clear of these, but I think in terms of it being the first attempt at creating this adjacent universe, it's noteworthy. Likewise, introduce the concept of kind of real world time and the stories taking place at a world where characters will age and real things will happen to them. Obviously, in a cinematic medium, as we touched on yesterday, Robert Downey Jr. will age out of the role of Iron Man, and therefore the character of Iron Man has to age with him. Tom Holland can't play a high schooler in 20 years' time, whereas Marvel Comics can keep Spider-Man as a teenager for as long as they want. So that introduction of the notion of superhero stories occurring in real time is also noteworthy here. And ultimately, the kind of idea of this Marvel universe being a world outside your window. However, the new universe fails due to lack of recognizable IPs. It was all original characters that audiences had no familiarity to, and the lack of cohesive planning and leadership. The animated universe is the first transmedia adaptation of the Marvel universe. It was successful in creating a nearly decade-long series with multiple installments, crossover events, with recurring actors and writers, that all culminated with an adaptation of Secret Wars. The Ultimate Universe, like we just touched on, was a modernized cinematic take on Marvel's universe, which inspired the visual style of the MCU and much of the plot and narrative of Phase 1 as well. So just to conclude, what I think the lessons that Marvel have learned from each of these imprints is, and how the MCU is kind of taking cues from them, I think it's interesting to consider the role that Kevin Feige's played in the MCU's success. One of the reasons why both the new universe and the Ultimate Universe inevitably failed was the lack of leadership. Jim Shooter was a very polarizing figure at Marvel Comics in the 80s, and within a year of the new universe being set up, he was gone from the company completely. Likewise, Bill Jemas was the executive who essentially created the Ultimate Universe, but he wasn't a comics guy. He didn't know a lot about Marvel Comics itself. And within 3 years of that being set up, he was on his way out of the company as well. And even with the animated universe, that was mostly outsourced to other companies, whereas obviously the MCU Marvel Studios is an in-house production. But overall, I would say that the MCU has combined the Ultimate Universe's visual identity and the aesthetical style of a modernized Marvel world with the animated universe's approach to storytelling, mixed with the new universe's approach to its incorporation of time and aging. And ultimately, I think the MCU reflects the rise and fall of each of these adjacent universes. And while the Marvel Cinematic Universe has become the most successful and most well-known adjacent universe that Marvel has created, within it, the legacy of each of these failed and somewhat unsuccessful attempts previously can be seen still today. Thank you.